Andrew, I want to thank you again for participating in this interview. My experience with you first time was so great. I felt like that 1 hour of conversation was one of the greatest learning experience for me. So tell us, why did you decide to write this book?
Well, I've been working in this intersection of business and kind of mega challenges and environmental and social pressures for 13, 14 years, and I've written other books and I've been working with companies for years, but I felt that the urgency was rising. The challenges we face, the science has gotten clearer, the speed that we need to move has gotten much clearer, the data has gotten much better, and that we were starting to ask kind of deeper questions in business, and I have posed them and others have, and that my previous books were really about why it was good for business to go green or to take into account kind of these issues outside of what people normally consider the core of the business and start to make them core. But that we really weren't moving fast enough. That in a lot of ways, Green to Gold, my first book, tells you in some sense what direction to head, but maybe not how fast. And then if you realize how fast you need to go, it actually brings up a series of different actions you need to take. You have to change your business in a more fundamental way to go as fast as we need to. And then there were personal reasons. Hurricane Sandy hit our region and hit my home and hit all the homes around us, and I thought, this is not some future thing anymore that I can talk about as potential risk for our business. It's happening right now. So we need to change the way business operates in a really fundamental way. And there's some great books and ideas out there about how do we change capitalism. But my question is always microeconomic. How do you change companies? What do they need to do? What decisions do they need to make in a different way to bring about the macro change that we need?
And who is the target audience for this book?
I think business books are always very, very broad, and it is a broad mass market strategy book. So this is for really all managers and executives. But within that, obviously, there needs to be kind of a psychographic element to who this is for. People who are willing to entertain that issues like climate change and extreme weather, resource prices, commodity pressures, and transparency, that these are very large issues, that these are global scale, that these are fundamental changes. And I say this in the book, if you're not willing to entertain that these challenge business at a fundamental level, you may not be right for this book yet. So I think it's for all business people, but they have to be not hostile to the idea that these are very big issues. So I think it's for a very wide range of people and executives in a lot of different functions. The core group is always people who focus on sustainability, but that's really just the germ. It has to spread from there, and this is written really for people who run marketing or run manufacturing or run finance. CFOs, I think, would get a lot out of this. CIOs, CLOs in your world, and the CEO. And it's really written for the leaders of a company or the people who want to be the future leaders.
Can you share with us how did you ended up coming up with the name The Big Pivot?
Originally, the book was called, in my mind, and I took it to the publishers, Radically Practical. The idea was that, again, if you believe the pressures that we're facing are as big as they are, it's not radical to suggest that we take very big leaps in how we operate or that we move to renewable energy from fossil fuel energy, that these are practical steps. This is not some green agenda, some tree-hugging agenda, it's just practical. I thought of some other names around that, and the publisher and I worked together, and I had thought about a big pivot, that we're talking about a kind of big mental shift, and that it really is about where are you focusing your energies? What's the priority? Is it short-term earnings only? Maximizing short-term earnings and getting to these things that seem kind of on the side of the radar later? Or is it operating in a way that solves these really big mega challenges and profits from that? And then working back from there, using the tools of capitalism, markets, and competition to do it most profitably. And that's the pivot. It's about which comes first.
Why did you categorize climate change as a mega challenge, and how companies can profit from it?
It's funny, a lot of companies, they don't want to use the words climate change. I think often in America it's so politically weighted, but I think we have to stop beating around the bush. I talk about extreme weather, that's the kind of one of the elements of climate change. The science on the connection between climate change and extreme weather is getting clearer and clearer. It doesn't mean any one storm, right? Scientists always say, well, you can't say Hurricane Sandy specifically was climate change, but the storms are getting bigger. They're getting tougher. The storm surges are getting larger. The seas are rising. The droughts are getting drier. Everything is getting more extreme, and we're breaking records, clearly breaking records on weather all over the planet. So I think we have to assess what are our, what's a big enough challenge. The former Treasury Secretary, Robert Rubin, has said, and I was at an event at the UN, and he said, climate change is an existential threat. You kind of can't say it better than that. I think we have other mega challenges in the world that when you see mega trends, you hear demographics, urbanization, the rise of technology, there's others. But for me, climate change and resources are the ones we have to address, or the others are moot. A tech executive once said to me, well, no one's really going to care what operating system they run if they can't eat. So there's just a very fundamental basis of our society, the pillars of our society that climate change and resource constraints threaten in an absolute fundamental existential way.
In terms of the resource scarcity, how it's creating a huge problem in the world. So can you elaborate a little bit about that challenge and why companies need to wake up now and deal with those challenges and how they can profit from that?
There's a tremendous pressure on our resources, and that comes from many reasons. I mean, we're 7 billion people now. We're rising to 8 or 9 billion over the next generation, and people are getting richer. This is a great thing for human society and a great thing for business. There will be more consumers. There will be people who need more of everything: televisions and refrigerators and homes and cars and insurance and financial products. But that's a constant pressure on natural resources. China alone right now uses something like 50% of the cement in the world, almost 45 to 50% of the steel and aluminum, half the pigs in the world, the pork, is in China. This is just a constant drain on resources. And I have an economics degree in college, and I go back to supply and demand, kind of very basic 2 lines, and the demand is just rising. And supply can't keep up. We are seeing that. The easy resources, the easy, cheap resources are not completely gone, but they're much harder to find, right? I mean, it is not easy to find oil as it used to be. It's more expensive. So companies are facing now rising prices. For the first time really in modern business history, prices are rising. They've been rising for the last 10, 15 years, kind of steadily, of almost everything. That means that over time, businesses and countries need to get leaner. And there's an incredible opportunity both to get leaner, to use less stuff, and to provide services that can help companies do that. There's an amazing entrepreneurial opportunity to create what many are calling a circular economy. How do we capture materials? Because as prices rise, at the end of a product's life or the end of a building's life, the materials in it are more valuable than they were when they went in. That's new. That's not the way business evolved 100 years ago, when things just always got cheaper. So this is a fundamentally different world with amazing opportunity, but clearly prices are rising. That changes cost structures and how businesses operate, and they won't be competitive if they don't recognize this and take a harder look at their methods.
Can you tell me a little bit more about how technology is forcing the organization to become more transparent, and why you think that's a huge threat for organization if they don't change?
Yeah, I think we're clearly gathering more data. We know that, right? I mean, we've learned from the work of Edward Snowden and others that the government is collecting all this data, but companies clearly are, and there's so many reasons. The technology is almost infinitely cheap now, right? I mean, every couple years, the amount you can collect, it gets cheaper and cheaper. So we're all excited about big data and the opportunities, but there's risks and opportunities there. And we are now expecting as a people to have information about the companies we're dealing with, that we work for, the products we buy, where were they made, what's in them, what's the carbon footprint, are the people working on the supply chain of this product living well? We're seeing into people's lives in the supply chain all around the world. The data's there, the exposure's there. When things happen, things go wrong in the supply chain, the names of every company associated with that factory or that site are splashed all over the headlines of the world. There's just no hiding anymore. And I think this is generally a good thing, right? I mean, as a few people have said, if we're all going to be naked, you better get buff. It forces you to take a hard look at your business and find the weaknesses and find better ways to do things, because it's going to be open to everybody and everyone's just going to expect that. And the next generation of workers and consumers, the millennials and younger, they expect to share everything, and they do, right? The connectivity level is unlike anything we've ever seen. There's the average American teenager texts 4,000 times a month. That's hard for you and me to even fathom, but that's only rising. We tweet 400 million times a day. I mean, there's just constant stream of data and information about companies, about their products, and the people in them.
chapter, the new mindset, and you used a quote there written by Albert Einstein. You said, we cannot solve the problem by using the same kind of thinking we used when we created them. I love that quote so much. What do you mean by new mindset? Give us a framework and how we can execute that.
You know, Albert Einstein was a smart man, and he said, he said this about we have to have a new mindset. He also said that he would, that if he had an hour to solve a problem, he'd use like 55 minutes to figure out the right questions, right? So we have to ask different questions. Now, I think the principles of what a pivot company will look like, a more sustainable enterprise will look like, are not necessarily easy to achieve, but I think we can imagine what they are. And I lay out a few kind of key ones in the book, things like the idea of decoupling, which means we might continue to grow and, again, serve 8-9 billion people, but we need to decouple growth of products and services from the stuff that goes into them, energy and water and waste that comes out of them. And you're seeing companies like Nestle kind of decouple so that their use of stuff is going down while they're making more things. Decoupling is one, circularity is one, finding this way to close the loop on products. So we bring back materials, we reuse everything. So we have to get less and less kind of new virgin materials. And third is this idea of regenerative, that products or businesses could actually help make the world better. So it wouldn't just be about can we use less energy. It's things like the business Kingfisher, a retailer in the UK and Europe, that says they want to help homeowners and contractors build buildings that generate more energy than they use. That's a regenerative business model. We're seeing the leading edge start to look at these principles, and they're deeply related: decoupling, circularity, and regenerative. They're all very much what you'd find in nature. That's the model of what's worked for 5 billion years. We can look to that. And they're new principles for most companies to really take in and think about what they mean for their business.
You talked about these 4 hurdles that are blocking the big pivot. One of the things you talk about is scale, time frame, and valuation. Can you elaborate a little bit about those hurdles?
We have to be realistic, right? When I say that something like climate change and extreme weather and resources are existential threats, that means they're very, very large. And so scale itself is a challenge because it causes the mind, I think, to shut down in some way. You look at it and go, what could we possibly do? How could we contribute? And that's partly, I think, why individuals have had trouble kind of grasping these things. But, scale also has its opportunities. There's economies of scale, right? And I think part of the solution is to just kind of address these things with very big goals. So you're bringing down your footprint aggressively, and you're kind of bring the problem down into ways that you can kind of cut it up and get at it in different ways. We also have a set of psychological and mental hurdles, right? And we have and I don't talk about it a lot in the book, but I think it comes up so often when I'm talking about these issues about how does change work? How do we learn, and how do we grow, and how do we make change? And we have these series of biases that so many others are writing about and studying, these behavioral economics issues about how we see the world. And do we think our efforts matter, or do we think this is a real problem because maybe we're not seeing it directly? Like if you weren't in the path of Hurricane Sandy, you can kind of write it off. And this is a way we all survive. And we can't be constantly scared and nervous about every possible risk. So we kind of discount some, or we heighten others. And so we have these hurdles that we need to get over and trying to be aware of them as we're working through changing organizations in a fundamental way.
Now that we talked about 3 major challenges and you provided 10 strategies how you're going to solve those challenges. So I want to go on one strategy at a time. And if you can just elaborate, what do you mean by strategy 1, fight short-termism?
There are many things we can do on the path to being more sustainable companies that have benefits very quickly. There's cutting energy use and water use, and this can save money quickly. But again, some of these problems are very large and they take longer term thinking. So what stands in the way, the fundamental hurdle, is this short-termism, that the markets pressure companies, public companies in particular, and pressure executives to perform in a quarter, in 90 days. This is kind of crazy when you step back and think about it. We don't operate in our own lives with a 90-day horizon. There's so much you wouldn't do in your life. You would never exercise. You would never go to school and take 4 years for a degree because it's painful, right? I mean, you would just eat French fries and watch Netflix and enjoy yourself because the short term would be let's maximize short-term happiness. So you need a mix of that. You need some things that maximize short term and things that take care of the long term, but we have all these incentives in the way. So I talk in the book about what short-termism does, the drag on innovation, the drag on thinking longer term that isn't just about sustainability issues, but anything that takes longer, and then lay out a series of kind of options. It's a very tough challenge, but a series of possibilities that companies can go down. And one is just don't talk to investors in this, as much. That's what Paul Pullman at Unilever has done, saying we're going to report quarterly. We're just not going to negotiate this or talk about it as much. We're going to build for the longer term. Second is to change the discussion with investors and actually talk to them regularly, but explain why these longer term issues matter and how they create value. And third is there's a real interesting movement to challenge the form of corporations, the B Corp or the benefit corporation, and to redefine a corporation legally, to say shareholders are not the only stakeholder we're going to maximize for. We're going to take into account our employees, our communities, our customers, et cetera, et cetera. And there are more and more companies saying we want that form, that legal form. These are all related. You can kind of do them all. I'm kind of partial to the walk away from Wall Street for a while approach and just think about what's going to make the company great in the long run and focus on that.
Let's talk about a little bit about the set big science-based goal. What do you mean by that? And I know that you shared some story about Ford and British Telecom. So if you can go into that.
This is, again, kind of one of the core ideas, and I guess the way I wrote the book was to think that if you have a problem, you have to set your goal to solve it entirely. And the way we set goals in companies right now is bottoms up, mostly. Mostly, you go to different divisions, you say, what do you think you can do? Especially something like energy reduction, say. You say, what do you think you can do? Can you cut 10% in the next 3 years? That's what we did the last 3. Let's do a stretch goal, maybe 12%. That makes some sense if the problem you have has no relation to kind of the larger world. But the reality is we have a scientific problem now. We have a certain amount of carbon we need to kind of reduce in our economy and out of the air. And we have numbers now from McKinsey, from PwC, that tell us how fast. That number from PwC suggests we need to reduce carbon in our economy by 6% per year. The intensity of our economy, how much carbon we emit for every dollar of GDP, needs to come down 6% a year. We're currently coming down at less than 1% a year. So that's the target. And so there are a few companies, some very big ones, who have said, given the science, given what we know, here's how we can change our business. So Ford did this. They looked at their product portfolio starting almost 10 years ago and said, what's the mix of products that will allow us to reduce the emissions of our products across their life cycle in keeping with the science? That's what we need to do. And the metaphor I use is that if you're in a boat filling with water, what you don't do is ask everyone, how much do you think you can bail today? You figure out how much you need to bail and you divide up the task. And that's what needs to happen now, I think, in the business and kind of government communities.
How can you get everybody to work together, and how do you deal with that major force like big oil companies not to oppose the initiatives that the companies that can benefit from?
Well, look, in a very big change, there's winners and losers. I think pretending there isn't is not going to be helpful. If we need to move away from carbon quickly, and we do, there will be shifts, right, in how we make our energy, how we use our energy, how much energy we use. And so companies that are entirely reliant on digging up or selling coal are going to be in trouble. And there's no way around that. And throughout our history in business and economies, we don't protect industries forever, right? If we don't have electric typewriters anymore, we don't have horse and buggy anymore, that doesn't mean you leave people stranded. We need to figure out as a society what to do about coal towns or places that are just going to be changed fundamentally. And these companies that are energy companies could make a big pivot, a shift to providing more and more renewable energy, and some are, but some are making it clear they don't want to. And they have tremendous political power. So there's another chapter later we'll get into about becoming a lobbyist and how companies need to actually go and lobby for a price on carbon or change. And there will be companies hurt by that, right? The ones who make fossil-based energy. But the rest of the world and the rest of the economy benefit from that. And we have to remember that because one sector might face change that isn't fun for them, that we give up all the benefits to the rest of society just makes no sense, and we can't do that.
Your strategy 3, where you talk about pursue heretical innovation, this is one of my favorite chapters where you talked about those 7 innovative questions that you can ask. And tell us a little bit about that strategy, what do you mean, and if you can share some stories.
So on the heretical questions, again, scale of our challenges, I think, require deeper change, right? And so that means challenging the way things are done. And I think we can be heretical in our business at a number of scales. And that's what you kind of noticed in the book, that not everybody's the CEO. Not everybody can ask, what's the purpose of our company? You can, but it's harder to implement that. But everybody can ask it about their job, about specific things. So I use the example of one particular product change for Kimberly-Clark, one of my clients, and they asked, why does a toilet paper roll or paper towel roll need the cardboard core? And they developed a technology to roll them. And if you've ever used the product, it's cool. It unrolls naturally, and at the end, there's no cardboard. To me, this is kind of a heretical, fun question. It plays with the nature of the product. It plays with the way consumers use it. And it's also not incremental. They didn't say, let's use 20% less cardboard. They used none, 100% less. We need to find those leaps. So there's leaps like that from little, small process changes, product changes, all the way up to the business model. Questioning what's the purpose of the company, questioning how it operates. We saw recently in the news, and this wasn't in the book, it happened after the book went to press, CVS said they're not going to sell tobacco in their stores anymore. That's exactly the kind of big pivot where they said, our goal, our mission is health, and this is not in keeping with that. That's a perfect example of a really deep heretical question. Could we stop selling some products that actually make them money? The news reported that CVS was 120 billion or something in sales, and this was 2 billion, so it wasn't such a big deal. That told me the people who wrote that have never worked in a company, because nobody can go under their boss and say, let's stop getting 2 billion in revenue. I mean, that's a big choice. So we're seeing companies, I think, start to ask deeper questions about how they work and what they're based on.
Your strategy for where you talked about change the incentive and engage the whole organization. Can you elaborate on that? What do you mean by that, and how company can use that strategy to change the culture?
At the beginning, we talked about the 10 strategies. They were kind of in buckets. There's the vision pivot, which was the first 3. And this is part of the valuation pivot. It's kind of an odd fit, but this idea of how do we value employees? What do we value in business? Not our values, but what do we put numbers on, and what are we incentivizing people to do? And so I think the first step is, how do you change culture? Honestly, I struggled with this chapter. It's very difficult. It's a very broad topic. I tried to pull in a few models that I thought were really, really useful about what changes organizations and where there are disconnects. But there's clearly just a kind of straight, I'm partial to the kind of straight incentives, the kind of concrete payment for what do you do, what are you being paid to do, what are you incentivized to do, and whether we've got the right incentives and pay plans for the top executives and for everybody else in the organization. And clearly for the top executives, we are, in most companies, incentivizing short-term behavior. That needs to change, and there are some really good ideas that I borrowed from a kind of expert in shareholder value for this book, for lengthening option payments, like kind of ways to lengthen their time perspective. Lower down, it's about, how do you pay people to go find these heretical innovations or to reduce the footprint. But there's also the softer stuff, which is what are people passionate about? And there's been many, many studies. Gallup has some great data on how much better organizations with engaged people do in productivity, in lack of turnover, et cetera. What's missing in this argument so far is very hard data on, if we know engagement makes companies more profitable, do we know that engaging in these topics, environmental and social issues, makes people more engaged? And we do anecdotally. Almost every company tells me they do, but it's hard to find hard numbers. And we're getting there. There's a few companies, I talk about Caesars Entertainment in the book, and they're building case studies working with, I think, Harvard. They're gathering real data on their incentives and on the engagement of people and how it makes them more passionate for work, and they bring their whole selves to work. This is, I think, one of the ways companies of the future are going to really succeed.
You keep talking about we need to redefine ROI or reinvent ROI, so can you elaborate a little bit?
I think we use a number of tools in business, have for many years, to make investment decisions. That's what companies do, frankly, is where do we invest capital? Human, financial, ethical, whatever you want to use. And we use ROI quite often, especially for things that fall into environmental, if it's in an energy project or something. The problem is ROI has some serious flaws. It's fine as a tool, as a mathematical tool, but we are very good at the I part. What's the investment? What is the cash outlay? We're really not good at the R part. We know exact cash payback for certain things, but value from a decision in company, an initiative, can be much, much broader. We know that intellectually. It can be things like reduced risk, improved resilience, which is kind of the core of this book. It can be employees being much happier and more passionate and more engaged. It could be customers coming to your doors or keeping you as a supplier because of the things you're doing. There's many aspects. And in fact, the percentage of a company's value in the marketplace that comes from the stuff that's easy to measure has been dropping for 30 years steadily. It's now much less than half of the market cap of companies as a whole is the book value. So this other stuff that we don't put a good number on is actually most of the value. And so I'm just saying that we need to recognize that and put numbers on it when we can. There are better and better tools. And recognize that we do spend on many things in business without an exact number. And I use marketing as an example. We put an ad together, we put it on the Super Bowl, we spend a ton of money. What's the ROI on a Super Bowl ad? Nobody knows. And we accept that. We can't know. We can't know it for R&D, for entering new markets. So this set of issues, how do we tackle these big, long, mega challenges? Sometimes that requires strategic choices that we invest in without an exact ROI, and that's okay. The issue of natural capital is, I think, one of the toughest in all of these challenges, because it's what that means, what natural capital means is that we get support as a society and our lives from nature. That sounds really obvious when you say it. Everything we have comes from nature. We either grow it or we cut it down or we dig it up or we eat it, whatever it is. We get protection from nature. Wetlands along the coast help protect us from storm surges. Forests cleanse water. And so a lot of companies and cities have realized for many years that nature can provide services often much cheaper than we can build it ourselves. New York City realized years ago that the Catskills were worth protecting and was much cheaper than building a water filtration plant. Much, much cheaper, saved billions of dollars. So how you think about that input of value into your business is what a very few companies have been trying to do. Dow is one, Puma is another, there's a few, and it's growing. There's been studies showing that more and more of the largest companies are trying to figure this out. The story I tell in the book, a couple of them, and is about companies building what's called an environmental P&L. And Puma did this. They tried to say, what's the value of everything that comes into our business from nature? If we had to pay nature for the service of clean water, of clean air, of a ton of carbon that we dumped into the atmosphere, what would it cost? And what's tough about this is they are externalities. I have an economics background. They are externalities for now. But the reason companies are doing this is it helps them figure out where their hot spots are, where their risks and opportunities are. If you're running out of water in a region, that's a risk to your business. But it also is this belief that some of these things will get valued. They will get valued by regulation or by markets, by customers wanting you to take care of this natural capital and kind of valuing how you handle it. And that's why they're trying to bring it into their business, because you can't manage something until you put a number on it. And so there's more and more tools being evolved to put a number on these very hard to measure benefits and costs from the world around us. I realized as I was writing this book that I think from a microeconomic perspective and think about what companies can do, what choices can they make. But in reality, when you're talking about systemic challenges like climate change and resources, if we don't change some policy, if we don't have government working in a smart way, we're only going to get so far. So I think companies have to do, and this might be the hardest pivot of all, that companies have to shift to asking for some regulation in a smart way, going to the state and national and global kind of organizations and saying we need a price on carbon in particular, or we need investment in the clean economy. This is going to be very hard for most companies. For the most part, government relations jobs in companies are meant to kind of fight regulation. It's just this knee-jerk almost that if it's coming from the government, it's going to hurt the business. And there's some truth to that in the past. So I'm seeing, again, a kind of group of leaders, real leaders, companies like Nike and Starbucks and a handful of others, go to Congress, go to Washington and say, we need this, because for all the reasons that the big pivot was, that I wrote it, which is if we don't solve these big climate problems, business isn't going to survive, business isn't going to do well. So we need to go ask for this as a group. And we're seeing these groups come together, in particular in something called the Climate Declaration. Hundreds of companies have signed this to say, this is a big issue, we need regulation around this. So I think we're going to see this more and more, but it means becoming a pro-climate, pro-environment lobbyist. That's unusual for companies. Yet again, when you look at the scale of the problems, no company, even the really big companies, no company's big enough to kind of tackle them alone. So they need to work together. And so you're seeing more and more kind of industry groups get together and say, let's work on a problem together. And my favorite example that I use in the book, it's one of my favorite stories, is that Coca-Cola recognized for years now that one of their footprint issues, one of their dangers or risks to the business was that they use in refrigerants, in the vending machines of the world, certain chemicals, HFCs, to cool their refrigerants, and they are unfortunately really powerful global warming gases. And so they believe that as we want to stop climate change and as there will be a price on carbon, that this will not be a viable way to do business. So they need to work with suppliers and come up with new technologies. But they alone, as big as they are, can't necessarily provide enough business or enough funding to suppliers to create new technologies. So they've been working with Unilever and the Consumer Goods Forum and Pepsi. So Coke and Pepsi are working together on this question of refrigerants, and they are, according to Fortune magazine, the #1 business rivalry of all time. And that's what I love about this, that they've realized that I think the core question in all this is, what do we compete on? What does a business really compete on? And for Coke and Pepsi, they're competing on taste and marketing and branding and positioning and distribution networks, not on how the drink is cooled. And so when companies step back and say, what can we actually work together on? I think the list is much longer than they realize. There's hurdles like anti-competition laws, and they have to get around that. We have to figure those out. But there are ways companies can work together that I think will be surprising and radical to many. We need everybody involved in solving the world's biggest challenges, and it's, again, not going to just be up to business, but they need, in some sense, to bring consumers along. And consumers, I think, have lagged on these issues for many, many years, and we could have a longer conversation about that. But sometimes it means going to consumers or business customers and saying, let's work together to reduce impacts. And sometimes that means saying, will you use less of our core product? And I think that's the kind of deepest heresy, because we are raised in business to sell more. We are incentivized to sell more boxes, right? More cases, whatever it is. But you're seeing companies, especially in business to business, realize that if they're partnering with their customers, they want to help them save money. They want to help them provide more value. So you see stories on the consumer side like Patagonia, advertising, don't buy this jacket, saying to the world, we want to make products that last a long time, and you don't buy what you don't need. So if they're the business selling you something that lasts a really long time, they can still grow. Patagonia might grow, but that does come at the expense of other apparel sellers. So it is kind of shrinking the pie of the people selling stuff that doesn't last, that can't be handed down, that are bigger footprint. On the business to business, you see it in a number of businesses. Waste management is one of my favorite stories. They're helping companies reduce waste because they want to reduce waste to landfill. Xerox and HP and others are helping companies print less, use fewer printers. I mean, this seems counterintuitive, but it is one of those things that I think companies need to do before somebody else does. This is not going to, if you put your head in the sand and think no one's going to figure out a way to drastically reduce what I do as a business, then you're kidding yourself. And so someone else is going to do it. So you have to compete with yourself. This is classic disruptive innovation, Clayton Christensen kind of stuff. It is about cannibalizing yourself before someone else does, but through the lens of how do we reduce footprint? How do we reduce carbon and energy and water? And that's going to be some of the key questions of this century. At the core, it's 10 strategies in the book, but really it's 9 surrounding this core of this idea of building a resilient company. And that's actually an issue that my editors and others at Harvard Business Press kind of focused on and asked me to write a piece on. And I wrote the cover story for Harvard Business Review magazine in the April issue about resilience in a hotter world. That all of these strategies together help build companies and organizations and cities and countries that can withstand change, right? We learned that New York City and many businesses around here were not resilient to something like Hurricane Sandy. I opened the book with the story of Con Ed, our utility, having a substation explode when it got wet, and Lower Manhattan was dark for 4 days. That's not resilient, right? That's not an ability to take things as they come. We can't prepare for every possibility, but if you build a system that has certain kind of principles, and I kind of looked into this a lot and kind of thought about it a lot, and I read works like Anti-Fragile by Nassim Taleb, and I think he's been a leader in thinking about black swan events, and this idea that if you're ready for the extremes, you can actually come out stronger is really interesting to me. So there's principles like modularity, distributed energy. Solar on everyone's home is more stable system. It is a more stable system. So one of my favorite examples is that Walmart's the largest solar buyer in the US. It's not a huge percentage of their energy yet, but when they've talked about why they're buying so much solar energy and putting it on so many stores, one of the executives said last year, we know that this will help us stay up and running no matter what the weather is or no matter who else is down. So think about how competitive that is, right? The competitive advantage of being distributed in your energy. You can run. Storm hits, you're still operating. You're selling stuff. While others, maybe they're on the grid and they're down. This is the benefit of renewable energy, right? And companies can put so much more renewable energy into their system than they realize at the same or lower cost. Walmart is spending not a penny more per kilowatt hour for their renewable energy. This is one of the things I want to leave everybody with is there is so much potential now. The technology is there, the price is there to make yourself much less reliant on the grid and on fossil fuels and move to an energy that creates all sorts of value for society and for your business, direct value for your business. Part of the research I wanted to do as I was thinking about the book and building the book was this question of goals and what goals do companies set. And I've realized for years that anybody following companies or working with companies, consulting with them, that there's a lot of benchmarking you want to do. I mean, in companies, they're setting their next set of goals for environmental and social issues, and they often want to know, well, what are others doing? And they have to kind of go out and look at reports and figure it out themselves. And I realized, well, why don't I set up a website that enables that much, much faster by putting it all in one place? So I've had a team of researchers over the last year, year and a half, and it's the top 250 companies, the biggest Fortune Global 250. We looked at every single company, looked at their annual reports, their sustainability reports, and said, have they set goals? Like, we're going to reduce energy 25% by 2020, or we're going to reduce our water use, or we're going to do this much in philanthropy. And we have 20 plus different categories, and you can search by category, by industry, by sector, by type of goal, by what part of the value chain. Is it about their suppliers or their own operations or their customers? The companies find this incredibly useful, and it allows you to benchmark and kind of get a sense of, are companies setting goals that are aggressive enough? Are they moving the ball far enough? And some are, much more than I thought, but you get a good sense of kind of what companies are putting out there as their targets.
And are you going to consistently update the data as the goal changes?
Well, we are. I mean, it's hard to keep it up to date. It turned out to be a lot more work than I thought, and we have researchers, and we're kind of constantly marking for ourselves, like, well, this one's now been updated, we have to go back and do that. And there will be lag. We're not going to be able to do it real time. And there's times of the year where new goals are more second and third quarter, they tend to be set. So we'll have more over the summer kind of updating. But yes, we're going to keep at least the top few hundred companies up to date as quickly as we can. And but a lot of the goals that companies set are 2015, 2020. Those aren't changing too fast. So it is kind of finding little new ones they set, or any company that kind of comes to the table now and says, we're going to set goals. So we are going to keep it up to date, but it's going to be challenging. And so we're actually going to start to make it easier, I think, for companies to just submit their goals. So maybe we don't have to do quite as much of the legwork. Well, Green to Gold I wrote with a co-author. Dan Esty was a professor at Yale, and it's probably one of the 2 or 3 best-selling books on kind of green business ever, or sustainability. And Green to Gold, I think, made the case that going green and thinking about environmental issues in particular is good for business and creates value in a few key ways. Reduces cost and risk, drives revenues and brand value. That's kind of the core of the book. And it tells some very helpful stories and provides a framework and a leaping off point for companies that say, okay, we want to go green. What should we think about? Green Recovery was meant to be kind of a short, quick look at once the recession hit. My Harvard editor said, you're writing a lot about this recession and how green can actually help with the recession, so write that book. And I did that very quickly. It was meant to be kind of a quick hit about, here's the ways that you can create value quickly, like getting lean, cutting back on energy, on waste, saves money. That's good in a recession, right? Quick payback things. And I started to delve into innovation more. That's where I introduced the idea of heretical innovation, that if you want to think about getting out of a recession or getting out of pressure, you have to think very differently and start to ask deeper questions. And then, of course, the big pivot is really saying that the level of urgency has risen and what it means to be a company in the mega trends we're facing. It's not a green book. It's not even really a sustainability book. It's about mega trends and the ones that are threatening society and threatening business in a very real way and are starting to cost business a lot today, not in the future. And that what it means to be a company has to shift. And the things you focus on and the ways you operate will shift in a fundamental way. I think the big pivot almost assumes these others, assumes that you get green to gold, you get that we should be green and it's good for business. This is taking it to a much bigger, I think, deeper level. It's a good question, like, why am I passionate about this? Because I think about this all the time, that often when you're really passionate about something, you can get discounted, and I try to tell people that, clients I'm working with, the audiences I'm speaking to, that I don't think things like climate change and resource constraints are important because I'm passionate about them. I'm passionate about them because I kind of clinically have looked at the world and think these are our biggest problems, and I want to work on the biggest issues. I mean, that's the reality. I didn't grow up a tree hugger. People use that like it's a bad thing, but I didn't grow up camping a lot. I didn't grow up with this sense. A lot of people in this field, they did. They kind of grew up or they took classes for this. I was in business for the first part of my career, first decade, in strategy and marketing, not in any of these issues, and then kind of made a pivot in my life. I wanted to match my business background to some things I cared about. And the reason I cared about it was that I was looking at the world and saying, our current business model isn't going to work. There's resource issues, there's this climate change thing happening, that it's just a threat to our existence. And I just want a prosperous world for myself and my children. This isn't, I mean, people talk about your grandchildren like this is some faraway thing. Like, as we get older, the world's going to get less stable if we don't address these things. And by the way, there's massive, massive potential in these are multi-trillion-dollar industries that are undergoing change. So there's huge wealth. I say it in the book, Richard Branson says that this is the greatest wealth generating opportunity of our generation. This is it, solving these problems. So I care about them because they're really big, and I think they're threats to our continued prosperity. And I think all 8 or 9 billion people that we're going to have deserve a prosperous world where they can become the best that they can, and they should have enough water and food and energy and a stable climate to live in. And we're not on that path right now. And business, in particular, can and should lead the change. It has the resources and tools to do it. And the government, I think, has many, many issues. Politics gets in the way of so much. Business is going to lead the change and can.